To the Rethink Vertical podcast. Today's episode is sponsored by the UAS Cluster Initiative. So today I sit down with Dr. Carl Dietrich, founder and CEO of Jump Aero. Carl and his team have been developing a high-speed, all-electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft system to help first responders save lives. At an industry level, he serves as the chairman of the General Aviation Manufacturers Association's Committee on Simplified Vehicle Operations. He is the author or co-author on 3 issued patents and multiple patents that are pending. Carl's earned his PhD from MIT's Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics. Prior to Jump Aero, Carl founded and led Terrafugia as CEO and CTO from inception in 2006 through its acquisition by the Zhejiang Geely Holding Group in 2017. Carl spearheaded the development of the first integrated rotable aircraft capable of converting between flying and driving in less than 30 seconds. He established and ran a world-class research and development center for Terrafugia focused on the development of novel eVTOL configurations and business plans for the emerging urban air mobility market. In addition to his work at Terrafugia, Carl helped develop the standards for the light sport aircraft on ASTM Committee F-37. During his 11 years at MIT, Carl founded the MIT Rocket Team, won 4 out of 5 design competitions, and won the $30,000 Lemelson MIT Student Prize for Invention. In 2000, he was recognized by the MIT Aero and Astro Department as one of 16 young alumni who have shown extraordinary accomplishment and subsequently received 40 under 40 awards from Boston Business Journal and Aviation Week and Space Technology magazine. Carl's been thinking about advanced air mobility as long as anyone around, and so it's been really interesting to get his perspective and insight on how the industry's changed and where he thinks it's really headed. So I hope you enjoy the episode. All right. Well, everyone, welcome to the Rethink Vertical podcast. Excited about today's guest, Carl from Jump Aero. Carl, welcome to the program. Glad to have you on.
Hey, thanks so much, Craig. It's great to be here.
Yeah. I wanted to kind of how we usually start this is for folks that don't know you and don't know anything about Jump Aero. And I think it'd be a good chance for you just to kind of fill folks in where you came from. How'd you get involved in the industry and a little bit about yourself as well?
Sure. Yeah. We'll do the brief life story, right? In a nutshell. Yeah.
Right.
So like many people in this space, I've been into aerospace engineering and aviation since I was a kid. I started saving up for my pilot's license when I was 8 years old. I knew I wanted to be an aerospace engineer, and I knew that being a pilot would help me be a better designer of airplanes. Got my ticket in high school, worked at the local aircraft hangar as an assistant mechanic, and then went off to MIT to study aerospace engineering, wound up spending 11 years at MIT, won a bunch of prizes and stuff like that, and founded a company called Terrafugia, which was doing a rotable light sport aircraft, an aircraft that could fold up its wings and drive down the road legally, met light sport standards and federal motor vehicle safety standards. And grew that company over the course of a decade, wound up selling it to the Zhejiang Geely Holding Group in 2017. That's the parent company of Volvo and Lotus. It's a big Chinese conglomerate. And then stayed on a couple of years post-acquisition, looked at not only the personal eVTOL and flying car stuff, but also the eVTOL air taxi market. We developed a number of concepts and some business plans along those lines. And then in 2019, I wasn't too happy with the way things were going inside the company and decided to leave and start over again. And one of the things that sort of drew me to that is that, hey, I had this 13 years or so of experience doing a lot of the hard stuff of like starting an aircraft OEM that's doing weird stuff. Right.
Yeah.
Like it's doing stuff that people just don't do, right, in aviation. And I felt like, okay, well, how can I best leverage that, given all the interest that's in this new space of emerging all-electric VTOL aircraft? What is something that I could do that other people aren't doing that is something that would add a lot of value to society? And I hit on this idea of, hey, what if we made an eVTOL specifically for first responders? So, and there were a bunch of reasons why I was drawn to that. I mean, it's not just the humanitarian good that can come from that, which I'm a big fan of, don't get me wrong.
Right.
But really, I felt like one of the reasons that you can't go out and buy a Terrafugia transition today is that our cost of goods wound up being way higher than we originally estimated. And that's a
Right.
pretty common theme when you're developing a new aerospace product, that you don't have a reference platform. Like when they're making a new, the new 737 or whatever, you've got a good way of estimating what
Right.
that's going to cost because you've got a huge track record of stuff that's come before. When you're developing a truly new aerospace platform, it's really hard. You've got big error bars on your cost numbers.
Yeah.
And I had the very painful experience at Terrafugia of that big error bar being way too high in the end. And as a consequence, we didn't have a viable product or a viable business that came out of
Mm.
that. And so when I started over again with Jump, the focus really was, how can we make sure that the product that we're developing is delivering some really high multiple in terms of value delivered relative to the uncertainty and the cost, right? So
Yeah.
and if we can make that ratio big enough, then the risk from a business perspective is low, right? And
Right.
that's really the thing that drove me to this life-saving mission, because the value that you're delivering when you're going out there and saving a life on every flight is through the roof, right? And
Yeah.
and not just to the patient, but to the insurance industry. So it really makes a huge difference when you're talking about the value of those few minutes in a short eVTOL flight to a health insurance company is like $50,000 an hour. If you have
Mm.
like a time critical emergency like cardiac arrest, it's just off the charts valuable, right? And so when you're talking about that, if I have a little bit of uncertainty in terms of my costs because it's a novel technology, novel platform, I'm going to be able to absorb that uncertainty and deal with it in the end. So
Yeah.
that's the thing that really drove me to this business model from an entrepreneur's perspective. And of course, I love the fact that we're out there saving lives, right?
Right.
That's just awesome. But it's sort of, in many ways, it's sort of like the icing on the cake. It's not the cake. The cake is
Mm.
the business. The cake is like how the fundamental economics of the business, and the fact that with Jump Aero, we're really opening a greenfield market opportunity. We're doing something that nobody does today with an aircraft. That's the other exciting part for me as
Mm.
an entrepreneur,
Right.
is that idea of like, hey, we're delivering a new kind of value to society with an airplane. So
Right.
those are a bunch of the factors that led me to be here and to start Jump Aero.
Yeah, I know when we got a chance to chat in person a few weeks ago, and you were kind of walking me through the business model. I mean, I have to be honest. When I think about first responder projects, probably like a lot of people, we think, oh, it's really good societal benefit, and that's really what the FAA has been looking at. Like, how does this benefit society? Because maybe it's more risky, but we're willing to push the bounds a little bit. But when you sat down and kind of walked me through all the front end work you guys did on the business model and the value, and then also what you learned in your previous life, I'm wondering a couple things. One is, what did you go into this going, I want to do this really cool project and let's see if there's a value in it? Or was it something triggered and was like, hey, there's some real value from insurance, from these the first responder organizations, like they're the way they have to respond in certain amounts of time? Was that what triggered it? And the second thing is, when you talk about costs, right, reining in cost or having a business model that can sort of hedge against some of those costs like you're doing, have other founders from some of these more advanced AEM companies, have they reached out to say, can you share with what you learned? Because I'm seeing a lot of companies go down this path of this really cool market that they see, but when you start thinking through the costs, it's like, how does this all play out in the long run? Do you see, are there things that worry you? And then also, what sort of triggered you to kind of get into this side of things?
Yeah. So, I mean, we spent a number of years at Terrafugia looking at the eVTOL air taxi business models,
Mm-hmm.
and developing different combinations of technical concepts and business models and putting them together. Okay, what sort of margins would we expect? What are the sensitivities to the operational
Mm-hmm.
economics of the business? And the bottom line is that those air taxi businesses are really an airline business model, right? You
Right.
need to be able to amortize the high cost of your asset by keeping your assets flying as much time as possible and keeping the seats filled as
Mm-hmm.
much as you can on every flight. And that's how you make that's the bottom line, really, is
Right.
how you get a return on investment from that asset. And the problem with, I mean, it can absolutely work, and there's definitely a significant market opportunity there, but there are also a lot of challenges that need to be overcome. And one of the things that was a big sensitivity that we really hit on, that I didn't like this sensitivity in particular, was that the the places that you want to fly are in densely populated areas, right? Because that's where you can keep your seats filled, like the downtown to the airport shuttle flight, right? You can keep seats filled on both legs. You don't have a lot of deadhead. That just costs you your operation money. But the problem is that those are also the most sensitive to noise impact. People who just, whether or not it's noise, they just don't want the thing flying over their heads. So you've got a lot of local politics that can get in and frankly wind up having a real cost to your business, because what they do is that you've got the local operators, particularly like in New York, the Port Authority, that can just like crank up your landing fees, right? That really changes your operating economics.
Right.
Landing fees go up significantly, right? And that's their throttle on how often you fly, right? So basically, the way that I was looking at this is like, wow, you're kind of giving up control of your business to this, government entity. And I was like, well, if that's happening, if you're giving up control of your business basically to a government entity, then let's see if we can make more money more on the front end, where we're delivering something to a government entity that they want, that they really want, and that society in general is going to really want. And again, this all drove me to this public use case of emergency response, right? Because there's very little pushback on the use of whatever to go out and save lives, right? If you're using it in this kind of first response context, people don't complain about the ambulance that's blaring down the street, the siren going or whatever. Like, yeah, it's disturbing everybody, but we put up with it as a society because that's going to save someone's life, right? Like, so it's the same sort of thing when a Jump Aero JA1 Pulse is flying into a landing zone. Yeah, you're going to hear it. You want to hear it. You want to stay clear of the area, right? But we're going to accept that as a society because, frankly, it's the best way of saving a life, right? And that's the bottom line. And that sort of motivation is something that everybody understands. It's something that's going to be very widely accepted. It's going to be embraced by society. There's not going to be a lot of local politics pushing back on that type of operation. It's also a sparse operation, right? So it's also not flying over you every time. In fact, it's very rare that you're going to go back and land at the same spot again, right? And it also is a business model that doesn't require you to keep your assets flying all the time. In fact, what the customer pays for, whether it's the operator of the aircraft or the medical department or the fire department that is operating the aircraft, they want availability. They don't want the aircraft to be out on a mission. They want the aircraft to be ready to go out on a mission, right? That's what they want. So that's actually great for a new technology, right? Where you may not, maybe some of these new aircraft might have a hard time maintaining that incredibly high pace of operations. There may be some unforeseen maintenance issues, right? Well, those unforeseen maintenance issues are going to have a much lower impact on a sparse operation where maybe you're flying once a day for 5 minutes. Then you need to keep your assets in the air as much as possible, right? So it's all those sensitivities that exist for that eVTOL air taxi mission that don't exist for this mission. And that's one of the reasons that I fell in love with this mission and wanted to start Jump Aero to do this. Also, that nobody else was doing it, right? Nobody had also picked up on, hey, it's great that electric propulsion can be green. It's great that it can be less expensive to operate, lower energy costs. It's great that it could be quiet. That's great. But there's this other advantage of an all-electric aircraft that's highly underappreciated, in that you can just like switch it on and go to full power instantly. Right. So it's like that is actually a fundamental enabler. It's a capability of an all-electric that a thermal engine just does not have, right? This is like one of the few use cases where we can say genuinely that even if you set aside all of the wonderful things about being green, about being lower cost to operate, um, a traditional thermal engine cannot do this mission, right? Of rapid response. You have to keep your engine running to keep your engine block warm, right? If you actually want to do a rapid response mission like the DoD does, like you got to keep your engine idling and burning fuel all the time so that you can like go to full power like that, right? Like that makes no economic sense from a commercial perspective, right? But for an electric, where you can have it be completely shut off and cold and just switch on and go instantly to full power, not wait for anything to warm up. That's huge. That is an enabler of this rapid response mission, right? A helicopter air ambulance takes 3 to 5 minutes to spool up. Our eVTOL, where our goal is to develop a safe, not rushed, rapid deployment that just takes less than a minute from call to wheels off the ground, right? Less than a minute, right? That's something that today nobody does. And you really can't do it with a thermal engine, right? So that's one of the things that I love about this mission is that we're not just banking on people wanting to be green or the DOCs, which have the potential to be significantly lower cost. But what if they're not? What if there's some unforeseen maintenance issue or whatever that that field issue that comes up in real world operations of electric VTOL aircraft that the whole industry is just somewhat ignorant of, because we're not doing these operations at that type of tempo today, right? So
high cost. I'm thinking about like high cost to get rid of batteries, as there is, right? There could be some crazy charges in recycling batteries that are just not yet known. And you were talking about the thermal engine spool up. In the Navy, we called that alert, right? So we had guys sitting in fighters on the runway or on the carrier with the engine running, because they had to respond in less than 10 minutes. And so you couldn't spool the plane up. So it had to sit there and run and burn fuel, which in the military, they have a pretty large budget. On the commercial side, you can't do something like that.
Exactly. It makes no financial sense at all, especially when you might only be flying like once a day or twice a day or something like that. It just doesn't make any sense to idle your engine constantly, right? Like that. So it's, like I said, it's a mission that's enabled by an all electric aircraft. So that's one of the things. And the fundamental range limitations of batteries, really not a factor for this, because the thing that matters for this mission is not how far can I go in an absolute sense, but how far can I go in 8 minutes, right? Because most of these first response companies are on contract to get to a certain percentage of their calls in less than 8 minutes, right? That's a typical ambulance contract with a private ambulance company. So that's ideal. So for an all electric, like 8 minutes, we can we can deal with the limited absolute range of an electric aircraft if we just have to fly for 8 minutes, right? Now, in reality, we can go much farther than that. But it's that real driver of the value is all about how far can I go in 8 minutes, right? And an all electric is perfect for that.
Yeah. So kind of walk folks through sort of the operational model. Like, how does this work? Call comes in. What happens? What's the aircraft like? Who flies it? Maybe some of those details, which I think are pretty fascinating.
Sure. Yeah. So nominally we would have 2 folks on duty with the aircraft. One of them is a pilot paramedic, or they could be an EMT, but a pilot first responder, let's call them. And then a maintenance support person. Okay. And so they're hanging out. The pilot paramedic is maybe flying the sim a lot, practicing different deployments in their operating area. Their aircraft is nominally based at a non-tower general aviation airport. They might have a little T hangar there, maybe with some solar panels on the roof, maybe a Ford F-150 Lightning pickup truck or something like that has a big battery in it, and a flatbed trailer. Okay. And the flatbed trailer will come into the con ops in a second. So now we've got these 2 guys. They're sitting there. They get the call and they get the GPS coordinates of the location. They've got an app on a tablet or on their phone that gives them an optimal trajectory based on winds aloft information and TFRs and all the other stuff that you got to factor in. But think of it like ForeFlight for this mission. right?
Right.
It's going to give them the pre-mapped. We've got a good topo map and where all the obstacles are and everything. So we've pre-mapped the landing zones. You've got a recommended approach vector into the landing zone that is nearest where the emergency is before you take off, right? So you got all that basically comes in instantly, right? So now the pilot and the support person go out and they do an abbreviated pre-flight. They already did their full up pre-flight before when they went on duty onto the shift and made sure everything was ready to go. But now they're doing an abbreviated pre-flight. The pilot gets into the aircraft, buckles in, energizes the system. The outside, the support person goes out, make sure there are no control locks on, make sure the pitot tubes are uncovered, make sure there's no birds nesting on the props or whatever, all those things.
Right.
Bangs on the fuselage, give them thumbs up, you're good to go, and then the pilot does their internal checks on all the systems, which are mostly the computer checking the aircraft and that all the systems are operating. Pilot wiggles the sticks, they see the response, good to go, boom, and they go. They're off, right? Like they take off. At that point, they're following the guidance trajectory to the approach to the landing zone, right? That now their head is in the flight, right? The support person, in the meantime, now gets in their F-150 Lightning pickup truck with their trailer, and they start going to the same location, right? It might take them half an hour, 45 minutes to get there. The airplane's going to get there in 5 to 8 minutes, something like that, right? Wherever it is in the coverage area. That coverage area is about a 30-mile radius from the airport, right? So you're covering about 2,800 square miles with one team of 2 people in an airplane, right? And you can get to any location in that 2,800 square mile area in less than 8 minutes. So that fundamentally changes the operating economics of a team of 2 people with like an ambulance, right? And you compare that, because now all of a sudden that could cover like 200 square miles or something like that, maybe in 8 minutes. Right now, we're talking about an order of magnitude more coverage area with a team of 2 people in a vehicle, right?
Well, and no risk too, right? They're not driving through stoplights. They're not making sure people are not hitting them in intersections, right? All of those things.
And so the other piece of this is that this is mostly a rural operation, right? In cities, you've already got 7.5 minute response times in most areas, right? Cities and suburban, densely populated suburban areas, you've got fire stations that are already appropriate. The cool thing is this is like moving the needle in rural areas where average response times are like 15 minutes, and you've got 4.5 million people that live in ambulance deserts where it takes more than 25 minutes to get there, right? So that this concept of operations is really moving the needle in those rural areas, right? And that's, to me, an exciting opportunity. That's the greenfield opportunity where you just can't do it today. It doesn't make economic sense to have a team of 2 people in an ambulance sitting by, and that's why you've got, in most of those areas, you've got a volunteer fire department. For example, of the 29,000 fire departments in the United States today, 18,000 of them are volunteer, right? And it's because it doesn't make economic sense to pay people full time to be standing by for an emergency, right? But with this vehicle, because this one team of 2 people can cover so much more area so quickly, the operating economics completely change. And that's the exciting bit, is that you've got these areas where previously it may have only made sense to have like a volunteer fire department, where now it can make economic sense to have 2 people full-time paid to cover this very large rural county or something like that, or 2 rural counties or something like that. So that's pretty cool. That that this new technology fundamentally changes the operating economics of rural first response. So that's one of the things that makes me excited about this, is that you're truly bringing a new capability to an area, to an underserved population, frankly, where it's hard to get first response today, and where the standard of care is significantly lower. And you may think, well, what's the difference between 15 minutes and 7.5 minutes that we have? And it really is the difference between life and death. If you don't have oxygen getting to your brain, you're going from 7 to 8 minute response time up to 15 minutes, right? That can be the difference between, dead and alive. That can be the difference between brain damage and no brain damage, right? that it's a huge thing for 350,000 out of hospital cardiac arrests every year. You've got stroke, about that many strokes. You've got severe trauma and injury, car crashes. You've got all sorts of truly time critical emergencies, to say nothing of like drug overdoses, or allergic reactions, even like drownings, chokings, like all these sorts of things where a few minutes really makes a difference when it comes to getting oxygen to your brain.
Yeah. So drivers driving to the scene, pilot EMTs flying to the scene. Is this a semi-autonomous operation, or are they just dead sticking this thing all the way? Like, how are they flying this aircraft?
Yeah,
they talk a little bit about the aircraft itself, how they're flying. It was kind of interesting.
Yeah. So it is a standing tail sitter aircraft, right? So it takes off vertically like a drone, and then the pilot flies prone. They've got a nice big belly window. They go into hover again. Again, they're landing almost every time in an unimproved landing zone. So you've got a nice big belly window. They've got an unobstructed view of the landing zone, just fantastic visibility of the LZ. You can do a very, very steep approach into landing zone because you've got, potentially obstacles around, that sort of thing. So and that's all part of the pilot training, is to get them used to, operating, making potentially steep approaches into unimproved landing zones, and doing the scene assessment, deciding where do I actually want to land. It is not an autonomous operation. It is a piloted operation. The pilot's making those calls, and they've got multiple potential landing zones. They actually make the calls to where they're going to land, right? The app gives them advice based on, winds and obstacles and spillage over obstacles and stuff like that they're going to guide them, but the pilot's still making the final call. Do they land here? Or do they land somewhere else? Right. So that's a pilot in the end. And there are a whole bunch of reasons for that, but it is not an autonomous operation.
Yeah.
We've talked about having it be like the cruise portion of the flight could be guided with like a flight director, where you link your app to the flight computer. And so that can help in terms of energy management, in terms of getting you into a stabilized hover at an altitude high enough above the ground where you can make an assessment of the landing zone. But the final approach is always going to be done by the pilot.
So you guys can use off the shelf, flight director, autopilot stuff. I mean, even Cessna 172 has pretty advanced autopilot features nowadays in the G1000. I've flown it a couple times, and it's like hands off from like almost takeoff to landing. So the pilot, do they need a commercial pilot's license? Do they how does that work?
Yeah. So technically speaking, no, they don't need a commercial pilot's license, because they're not transporting the patient in the aircraft. So this is not a Part 135 operation. It's a Part 91 operation. They're just flying themselves to the scene, stabilizing the patient. You've still got an ambulance going to this emergency, right? That might be the volunteer fire department or whatever, right? You still got that going, and if necessary, that what I said was a Ford F-150 Lightning could be an ambulance with a tow hitch on the back, also, right? If that was needed. But the idea is that the pilot paramedic gets to the scene, stabilizes the patient, an ambulance shows up, the pilot paramedic goes with the patient in the back of the ambulance to the hospital. They leave the aircraft there. The second person shows up later with the retrieval truck and trailer, loads the aircraft on the back of the trailer, plugs it into the charger, takes it back to the base. In the meantime, the pilot paramedic has handed off custody of the patient to the emergency room doctor or what have you, and then goes back and meets the team at the base. So that's the concept of operations in a nutshell, and that's how you then get back in your ready state, ready to go again.
Yeah, really, really fascinating, and not something I'd ever really thought about. But it's interesting to see how you guys learned. Like, okay, well, we learning through like talking to folks, interviewing folks, we actually need the EMT to go with the patient. We don't really, it's not a value for them to fly the aircraft back. It's really more value for them to go and just trailer it back. That was interesting when you said that to me. I was like, okay, well that's something new. Wouldn't have thought of that.
So there are a lot of people ask, well, why don't you just make it an autonomous flight back, right?
Yeah.
Like or something like
Yeah,
that.
right.
Once you dig into all the aspects of certifying autonomy and legal reserves, 91, 115, like all that,
Yeah.
like energy.
You've been through that. You've done that, right?
Right. We don't want the pilot worrying about energy reserves on the return trip when they're going out. We want them worried about getting there safely so that they can save a life. Right. That's what we want them worried about. Right. So that there will be energy on board. Perhaps most of the flights you would be able to make the return trip legally and all that sort of thing, but you might not. Batteries do have limited range. If you're out towards the end and you really gunned it the whole way, right, and you were fighting a headwind or whatever, right, you might not. You might not have energy to fly with a legal reserve on the return trip. So again, don't plan on it. Don't plan on it, right? Like it makes more sense anyway. That return flight does not add significant value to the overall concept, the overall system.
It's just repositioning. That's all it is at that point, right?
Exactly. It's repositioning and makes much more sense to just drive it back because you can be recharging the battery while you drive it back.
So it's basically ready to go. As soon as you get back, it's ready to go again.
Exactly. Right. It just makes everything less critical. It makes everything less on the edge, right? Like the goal here is to make a time critical flight and get help to the patient as quickly as possible in a safe way where we want to de-risk, we want to make everything else not fast, not rushed, not, and even that part of the flight should not be rushed. It just doesn't take very much time to execute, right? That's really the key is that that's just normal. That's how we always fly at 200 to 250 knots, right? That's just, that's normal.
Okay. So, as we wrap up here, with founders, especially those that have had previous startups, I always like to ask, if you could have done something differently, what would you have done? We've had that opportunity, right? You've done it once, you're doing it again. What are one or two things that you have seen done or done yourself that you're like, we're going to do it different this time? Maybe to share with some of the other founders early in the process out there listening.
Yeah, I mean, we jumped in at Terrafugia very aggressively, very early on, and you get a lot of that from the what I would say the Silicon Valley mindset, right? Which has a lot of value. Like definitely the rapid iterations, that's a great thing. But I would say choose your target wisely. Try not to do something that other folks are doing. On the one hand, that's validation. On the other hand, you're probably going to be second or third. And there's not necessarily a disadvantage being second or third from a process through the regulator perspective. There's actually an advantage, I would say, to being later when it comes to the regulator figuring out how to deal with stuff. I would say you want to be second or third when it comes to that, because then they'll know how to get you through the process faster, right?
Right.
But when it comes to the tech, you generally, or the business model, you generally want to be the first, right? You want to be the opener of the green field when it comes to the business model, not necessarily when it comes to the certification pathway, right? So it's sort of weird in that way, I guess. That would be my advice. And then and just assume it's going to take more time and more money. Then whatever your best estimate is, triple it, right? Like, and then maybe you'll be about right. Like that would be my when you're doing a new novel aerospace thing, right? Make your best estimate and then triple it. And then you'll probably be in the ballpark. That's my personal experience with this. Is like, it's going to take you more time and more money than you originally estimate. So make sure that if it does, and you'll say, no, not for me, because I know what I'm doing, right? Okay. And I thought so too, right? Like, but if it does, make sure it's still a good investment, right? Like I would say that's the thing that if it does take 3 times as much time, 3 times as much money, is it still a good investment?
Right? Oh, that's good. Yeah.
Like, and
that's
if
the starting point,
if you
right?
can still say yes, then okay, go for it, right? Like, if you can't, then maybe back up and reevaluate. That would be my
That's great advice. That's a new one, and I like that. Triple what you think, and if it's still a good business case and still fits, and you learned that through through experience, so you know what that's all about.
So we always used to joke, we were a bunch of nerdy engineers. We were always used to joke, well, pi is a truly universal factor. You see it in all these different equations. We saw it in our costs and timelines and all that.
That's right.
Well, we took about pi times as long as we thought. And had that much more money too, right? Like, So, yeah.
Very good. All right, Carl. Well, I appreciate you. I know you got a lot going on. I appreciate you taking out some time to have a conversation, and I know folks will find it super valuable and interesting. And let's hopefully continue the conversation. Maybe there's a part 2 when you guys get down the road. I'll be interested to see how this all plays out. You get the aircraft up and going and doing some demos, and hopefully I can catch one of those.
Awesome. Yeah, and hopefully it doesn't take 5 times as long, but we'll see.
Right. If you'd like to be a part of the UAS Cluster Initiative community and get access to more of our content, check us out at www.uascluster.com.